together with Dr. Soldatic, who is a Canada Excellent Research Chair in Health Equity and Community Wellbeing. She's also a professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University. And so it's such an honor for me to be able to interview to her as a person from community with disabilities. I am really honored to having you here, be able to ask you all these questions that are really relevant to the space, the equity space in science policy. So, uh, Dr. Sodatic, would you, I hope that you have a, um, a great time being with us. So for the first question, I was wondering, given with your expertise in disability studies and marginality, what are your thoughts on the importance of highlighting the intersectionality of disability studies and accessibility in Canadian science slash health policy?
Thanks so much, Tam, and thanks so much for inviting me for the interview. Before we start, I would like to actually offer an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country and land throughout Australia and Canada, and would like to pay my respect to elders past and present, acknowledging First Nations people's shared experiences and impact of colonisation on health and well-being, their families, kinship networks and communities. So thank you for the question. It's a really often disability is left out of particularly the scientific realm. I mean, first of all, we really need to think about what does disability represent? And if we think in the Canadian context, disability represents a significant segment of the population. Recent census data indicates that 27% of Canadians aged 15 or older live with at least one disability. This equates to 8 million Canadian, and it's an increase of 4.7% since the 2017 census. So when we talk about disability in Canada and we think about it in relation to science and policy, we really are in fact discussing 1/3 or 1 in 3 Canadians. So this number also alone highlights the necessity of bringing disability perspective to all areas of Canadian scientific and health policy. And if policy is not inclusive for disability, then leaving out and excluding a significant percentage of Canadians overall. And to give you an example of that, in 2020, 54% of discrimination complaints accepted by the Canadian Human Rights Commission were on the ground of disability. So the issue of exclusion in policy, science, service delivery, across all facets of Canadian society is really important. And then this becomes again even more important around the question of intersectionality, which you asked. So if we look at the data just by disaggregating on historical notions of gender, male and female, the rate of disability is higher among women. It's 30%. For men, it's 24%. And that women with disabilities are more likely to have severe disabilities, particularly impacting on areas around employment and labour market alongside post-secondary education. So that has lifelong consequences. And so there becomes if we think about intersectionality in relation to gender, women with disabilities are particularly disadvantaged. Then if we look at the data and reflect on Canadian Indigenous communities, then again, that's 30% of Canadian Indigenous communities live with disability. And if we think about the numbers overall, that's considering that Indigenous Canadians are overall a very small segment of the population. So what this really tells us, what the data tells us, is that disability, discrimination and disadvantage becomes more pervasive once other markers of inequality, such as gender, race, class and indigeneity are also factored in. So we need to really bring in disability, questions of disability, questions of ableism and bias, and practices of discrimination in policy making and in science development, innovation, and technology, if we really want to really adjust issues of and respond to issues of equity to ensure that we're addressing all of the Canadian community and population.
Thank you for your thought-provoking and also very insightful response to the intersectionality of disability studies and accessibility. Um, Based on your research, where you inform a lot of different stakeholder, including the industry, public institution, and service providers in global disability and inequality policy, what would you say would be like the key important issue that matter the most to community with disability in Canada and internationally?
Thanks so much, Tam. That's a great question. So, in question, I really came up with three key points that really drive the disability rights movement nationally within Canada, but also globally. The first one is the idea of nothing about us without us, which is a key platform for the disability rights movement, both nationally and internationally. And this is really about ensuring that people with disabilities are the lead partners in any new innovations and policy developments that have a direct impact upon their lives. Most people, particularly in the scientific and policy realm, would think that the issue of disability is not something that they would consider. That disability is really associated with social care policy, social security policy, or social housing. But we really need to think about it much more comprehensively than this. And to give you an example, about AI and how embedded AI has come into everyday life. There's a growing divide around the disability digital divide, and that's because everyday tech design has really not been inclusive or considerate or considered issues of disability and how to bring disabled people into those design processes, discussions, and so forth. So that's really the primary area, nothing about us without us. The second one really is living in poverty and the implications for lifelong social emotional well-being, growth, educational development, and other areas of social and legal policy that reaffirms the rights to issues around secure housing, access to appropriate social supports, social security policy to address systemic disability discrimination. Poverty associated with lifelong labour market exclusion and disability is a social structural determinant of health and well-being, both for people with disabilities who already have a disability, but also particularly for equity groups, not having access or the social determinants of health really often lead to the production of disability. So living in poverty is a huge issue if we want to think about long-term health. The other issue and the final issue in thinking about the three core areas nationally and globally is in terms of healthcare. Persons with disabilities face extensive barriers to accessible and appropriate healthcare and affordable healthcare. Globally, people with disabilities are seeking adequate healthcare that is free of bias. So, not just access to, if we think about clinical settings and the kind of resources available in clinical settings, such as adjustable examination tables within regular GPs, general practitioner clinical environments, but also in regards to the right to healthcare overall and practices such as triage. One of the things that we saw in COVID is that many people who presented to hospitals with COVID who had disabilities were really put at the bottom of the queue because they were not considered, their level of survival compared to the able-bodied population was deprioritized in the triage process. And this was a global phenomenon. Even the administration of vaccines, when they became available, even though people with disabilities are far more susceptible to the long-term impacts of COVID, often they were last in the queue, or were not considered a priority group in vaccination distribution. And if we think about issues around intersectionality, again, if we think about 30% of women, Canadian women live with disabilities, then we just have to think about issues around reproductive health and sexual health care. And we know that women with disabilities don't have equity of access to women's reproductive and sexual health care. So access to health care is a key issue, not just at the policy level, but also thinking about the kind of resources they have access to, attitudes towards people with disabilities within the medical profession, and also the clinical environments and space.
Mhm. Thank you. I've started reflecting about the amount of the amount of knowledge that I know of when it comes to the lack of equitable access to healthcare when it comes to community with disability, a very big relevant issue. And when you were mentioning about the notion of nothing without us, nothing for us without us, you mentioned briefly about the use of AI and how we can make AI more accessible for people with disability, including people with disability. So that brought me into this next question where you were talking about that AI aspect. In your most recent work, you discussed the role of digital technology like data-driven AI-powered technologies in the process of truth making, what the importance of what you call a human in the loop decision making to maintain that accountability and appropriateness for its intended purpose, especially for marginalized communities. What would you envision that human in the loop process, human involvement process look like in the context of AI policy development?
So this is a great question, Tam, and thank you ever so much for linking it back to nothing about us without us. In thinking about AI models, we really need to think about the inclusion of disability through interdisciplinary practices of co-design. And that's really about ensuring that AI engineering and computational data analysis, such as LMM, NLP, center disability within the design process from ideation, conceptual development, actual models of design and modeling, training of AI, ensuring that disability examples are brought in within the training model, implementation, testing, trialing, and review. So making sure that there's a comprehensive process embedded from the throughout each stage and really at the beginning. And that's the only way to ensure disability bias and discrimination is eliminated. So that through that process about having humans in the loop, that really is about using disability advisory groups and user groups that are representative of differing communities at each age of design. So AI policies really extend beyond engineering. We need to think about open access, commercialized AI technologies. You know, they have to really be regulated for individuals, institutions, and governments. Especially when we think about most AI development at the consumer level is all through capital investment and commercialized AI technologies. So as researchers, we can not only contribute to the development of these AI technologies, but also identify what are the existing limitations and inherent biases by providing guidelines for future research and applications. The adoption of these guidelines can be implemented through rule-based models within interfaces, But this also requires awareness campaigns and legislation to ensure proper regulation. And I guess one of the things that we wanted to do today was really give you a little bit of an example of the work we're doing around this, on the projects that we're working on in at the moment, developing a large AI LLM model that seeks to address the rise of technology facilitated violence against women, but particularly with a focus on women and girls with disabilities. In our research to date, we found that there are no existing large-scale data sets in relation to tech-facilitated violence, so against women and girls with disabilities. So therefore, we have to create our own. So this is the predicament. Despite 30% of the population in Canada alone, women living with a disability. And what we know is that existing overwhelmingly focus on women or gender diverse women, and issues of tech violence against women and girls with disabilities really remain absolutely invisible and neglected within the models that exist. And for us, this is very problematic because, international evidence from WHO and UN Women, as examples, they all recognise that women and girls with disabilities are disproportionately impacted with the rise of tech-facilitated violence. So putting humans in the loop, therefore, really acknowledges the diversity of humanity and ensures that when we think through human inclusion within the AI development loop, we are inclusive of all representative groups and avoid large-scale homogenization around a single idea of being human, or of disability. That disability in and of itself involves different identity markers. By what we're trying to do, which is really developing a database for AI generation free from bias in this area, we're also trying to develop a robust AI model that can leverage this data and that can integrate disability non-bias into the engineering research field. And this is really, really about setting the framework for future policy in this area to ensure that disability and the gender dimensions of disability are a centre to any kind of tech design that really is suggesting that they're bringing in gender to their analysis and development.
Thank you so much. I didn't know that there was not a database that includes women with disability. That's really that's really hard to hear and surprising in my end. And I'm learning as you're telling us story, and it's I'm looking forward to the amount of great work you folks are working on, and it's I'm assuming it's going to be a lot. There's going to be a lot of amazing, meaningful data and algorithms being produced that is bias free and supporting people with disability. Um, so in my last question for you is, you have worked on numerous projects in different public institutions, from small service providers to global policy institute and multinational corporations. How has the landscape for inequality and marginality policy have changed, and I guess if not changed over the past 10 years in both Canadian and international contexts?
So, I think that really the best way to start this is to think about the landscape as something that's become more contradictory. So, what we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years, there's really been tensions across the political landscape in relation to the development of disability socio-economic programs. For example, as I mentioned earlier, there's been substantive recognition of disability at the population level, and we see things like the census data at the global scale becoming more nuanced, trying to understand what disability means, is how it's experienced in everyday life within a national context. But at the same time, these kind of national data sets have not really directly translated to policy actions in response to the diverse needs. And if we want to take the Canadian situation, the Canadian disability population. One of the problems too with statistics in this area is that even though they're becoming more nuanced, often they also neglect to with disabilities who are living in Canada under precarious or non-citizenship status, such as refugees and asylum seekers. So all of those factors, if we think about immigration policy, having a disability, it's very hard to really get access to different kinds of supports and services and often allowed in. Whilst we have maybe growing internal recognition in relation to border policies, there's a number of tensions there. As I spoke about before, the pandemic really highlighted significant cracks and gaps in healthcare and social welfare systems, spurring on renewed debates around the role of universal basic income and access to disability health equity and the social determinants of health and what that means for disabled policy across the life course. And the other key growing policy of concern disabilities across Canada in particular is the increased use of MAID as a mean to address the underlying social structural determinants of health and well-being with the significant gaps to have emerged post-COVID. One of the things that we've been doing here, we've got one team led by Danielle Laundry that's working on the policy area to monitor media representations of MAID, especially with its expansion to the notion of mental illness as a sole criteria for eligibility, and that comes into effect in 2027. And to give you an example of that, by 2024, over 4% of all deaths in Canada were through MAID, and this represents a 31% growth over 2021 since. And disability organisations and advocates have raised these concerns about the Track 2 MAID and the route for people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. So this includes recently launching a charter challenge, arguing that expansions with Track 2 disproportionately affect marginalised groups living with disabilities, leading to premature deaths that are really grounded in social inequities like poverty, lack of appropriate housing, not just housing in terms of a house, but also appropriate supported housing to enable people to live well and access the supports they need. There are other effects around gender. So in the Ontario May Death Review Committee of 2024 noted gender disparities in MAID deaths in 2023. Over 61% of MAID deaths in Ontario were female. And that's because women face unique challenges, they have longer lifespans, provide more caregiving work, and therefore have a less of a strong economic base and more likely and therefore have less options in developing appropriate care regimes and infrastructure to enable them to live well. So this is one of the key areas of policy concern that's growing. So there have been, for example, at the national level, the disability benefit payment that was in the last budget. These things are welcome, but also through lack of growth and economic investment and policy development around core areas that underline the social determinants of health. People with disabilities have really been compelled to take on other options that really are about significant gaps in policy. So I think overall we can say it's very, very contradictory landscape, and with the changing political environment both globally, we're going to see these tensions emerge further and further.
Mhm. It's yeah, it's really eye-opening for me to hear that some of the things that we taken for granted, like basic food, access to food, housing, um, um, financial security is something that is still such a huge issue within the equity space, and I'm I reflect so much about, I resonate so much on so many things that you have talked about in throughout the entire conversation. I will ask you one last final question, and this is more so just to get your opinion about the value of Canadian Science Policy Center and its position in the community as a connection hub, knowledge mobilizer, and talent in the science and innovation policy landscape.
Um, that's a great question. Thanks so much, Tam. Well, I'd just like to close to say I think that you provide a very important platform to really link community ideas into science policy, to get scientists and researchers and policymakers to think about what is it that community are seeking in terms of science development and initiatives, and also to link scientists, policymakers back down through to community so there can be a greater dialogue between the two. And I think interviews like today really provide a platform for that. And it's great to have a central hub. The importance of having a central hub such as yourself really provides a place that becomes known to the community, that they can find the access to resources that they want to, and also reach out to the people that you've profiled through the CSPC. So having that central hub is ease of access in terms of knowledge mobilisation nationally, and that's really an important feature of the centre because it ensures that community members across Canada don't get lost with all the information out there. It's easily accessible, and then they can use it as a point to reach out to others that they would like to work with or follow up with in their key areas of interest.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. Um, I think that concludes our interview. Again, I'm so glad that we were able to reach out to you and be able to set up the interview online like this so that things can be more accessible for both you and me to be able to conduct this, insightful and thoughtful interview. And I from um, your information and the work and the amount of knowledge that you have shared with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tam. Thanks for reaching out.